Good morning, all, and welcome to our live conversation today on social impact investment for NFP leaders and funders. I'm Andrew Bird, the founder and MD of Foundstone Advisory, and your host for today. And we'll just give it a few minutes for people to file in. I'm joining from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne this morning. And our panellists, who I'll be introducing shortly, across 3 different states. Vic, we've got Victoria. Hi, Suzanne. Luke, Queensland, and Myron in South Australia. We'll introduce you all formally shortly. And it'd be great if you could put into chat where you're dialing in from, location or organisation, or even your role. It's always good to see who's joining. We've had a real diverse and broad mix of people registering for the event. I think most areas of Australia. We've got providers across healthcare, disability, employment, aged care, education, mainly from the for-purpose sector, but also from the for-profit. We've got funders, philanthropy, impact investment, and we've got also government and peak bodies joining us, which is wonderful. So we'll give it another minute or so. It's middle of the winter down here, down south. So we're rugged up, aren't we, Suzanne? North, you probably got a bit more sunshine up there. Welcome, Ben. Welcome, Chris. Look forward to having you part of the conversation. I know Luke, you're back from just a day or two back from a couple of weeks leave. You're back into it. So thank you for making the time. Welcome, pleasure. Wendy from cold Melbourne. And so part of the intent today is really the mix of different stakeholders, let's call them, attending, from providers, funders, and government and peaks. The intent is really to continue a conversation, a lot of good work that the panelists today have been doing for many years, to continue that conversation in an impact lens. And so we're looking forward to hearing from you all as well on chat and Q&A as we move through. Welcome, Louise, Zara, David, Wollongong, Northern New South Wales, Kat. Welcome, Julie, Sydney, on the Ned from RACGP, fantastic. Yeah, we've got quite a few people from healthcare and the broader human services, of course. So wonderful to have you all with us. All right, let's kick it off, and people can continue to file in as we go. So again, I'm Andrew Bird, founder and MD of Foundstone Advisory. We're Australia's first open strategy consultancy, which means that we work with various executives and boards, facilitating the end-to-end process with them. And that really includes opening up that core strategy process to include partners, funders, government, and industry experts, really embedded as a core part of the core strategy process. There's a real co-design element to what we do. We work predominantly across healthcare, human services, employment, and education. So across the for-purpose sector, but also in the for-profit sector with various corporates and funders. Just a brief bit of housekeeping again. So today is going to be a pretty free-flowing conversation. We're going to keep it as less scripted as possible. I've just got a few slides up front as a scene set. But we really want to hear from you in the chat. We've got the chat, obviously, the Zoom chat, and then the Q&A function. So we'd love for you to tap in your reflections or comments as we go through, and also your questions. We'll have Q&A at the end, but I'll also be turning to questions as we go through, and really happy to kind of raise some of them as we move through the conversation. Just want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, being hosted from this country in Melbourne, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So today's panel, let's formally introduce who we've got on the line. Today's panel is made up of three really key CEOs in the for-purpose space, and we want to get leaders who could both share their own personal journey, their professional journey in the impact space, to have a bit of a PD element, a learning to it, but also to share those real-world examples from their own sector and their organisation. And even in some of the prior conversations, I'm really interested to hear some of those cross-sector conversations across employment, mental health, and broader, even within the panel. So, Luke, I'll start with you. Welcome, Luke. Luke is the CEO of Whitebox Enterprises. He's an absolute pioneer in Australia's social enterprise and impact ecosystem. Luke founded Whitebox Enterprises in 2019 to address the constraints he himself confronted when launching various social enterprises. And those challenges including access to varied and different sources of capital, investments and partnerships. Whitebox Enterprises have launched 4 new social enterprises in Australia, including the well-known Beacon Laundry and Australian Spatial Analytics, to name a couple, creating hundreds of new jobs and systems around those to support ongoing employment. Luke and Whitebox have led the Payment by Outcomes trial, which is an absolute first of its kind in Australia, directly with the Department of Social Services, and really looking forward to hearing more on that. He's raised over 50 mil in the organisation of blended capital for job creation projects, and has real backing across major corporates and philanthropic organisations. So, Luke, thank you for joining us and giving a bit of your time on your second day back from leave.
Thanks, Andrew. It was a very kind introduction.
Next, we have Suzanne Dick. Suzanne is the CEO of Prevention United, one of Australia's foremost mental health prevention organisations. Prevention United work across the leading mental health organisations and research institutions in Australia, working and advocating with governments and funders to help solve some of those real upstream problems in mental health and wellbeing. Prevention United were chosen by Future Generation, who are an ASX-listed impact fund, to be a key provider in their wellbeing and preventing mental ill health in young Australians' impact investment initiative. Suzanne's also a pioneer in the preventative mental health space in terms of the new models and impact it's bringing. And looking forward to hearing all your insights from sector and impact, Suzanne. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Look forward to a great conversation.
And last but certainly not least, we have Myron Mann. Myron is the CEO of Bedford Group. Myron leads Bedford, who are the second largest disability employer in Australia. Under his leadership, Bedford are reshaping and modernising the disability and employment landscape in Australia. Across 1,500 clients, 22 sites, Bedford have rolled out various advanced manufacturing initiatives, including a furniture line exclusively with Bunnings, just one of the many services that are broadening open employment opportunities in that sector. Bedford have established various independent investment and revenue streams to grow community-changing employment outcomes, one of which is Cultivate Food and Beverage in SA, and I'd highly recommend us all checking that out. And in my conversations with Myron, he's always able to break down those really complex funding and investment opportunities and really enable the simplicity and clarity around them. So welcome, Myron. It's great to have you part of the conversation.
Thank you, Andrew. Looking forward to today's conversation.
So just a brief bit of a scene set of why before we jump into the panel. So we've been having a number of conversations across our community in which we work. And as a strategy advisor in mainly the for-purpose sector, we see how important it is for both leaders and organisations to really uplift and embed impact directly into the strategy process. So we're not talking about this as an afterthought or an add-on. We're talking about having impact, measurement, and those related funding models considered right up front at a board and exec level to be really core to the problems you're trying to solve. So we see mindset is really key at a board and exec level, and we'll be talking a bit more about that. There should be alignment right across the organisation in the impact space, and we're talking from frontline staff who are delivering the programs and services through to mid-level management running the people systems and other aspects, right up through to the executive, of course, right up to the chair, who are really shaping a lot of these business models and differentiated funding. We see some organisations who are perhaps, looking at impact and doing impact fairly well at a program level, a pretty solid theory of change or impact logic. But we see there's a pretty big opportunity to bring in the board really early in that strategy conversation and start to shape and get alignment right across the organisation. We're going to be hearing a fair bit today about that really imperative to shift from activity-based funding to outcomes-based funding. And we're using the topic of social impact investment really as a frame today to talk a bit more broadly around those fundamentals of those outcome-based principles. And regardless if your organisation aiming to have a full impact in investment piece of funding, or if you're at the start of your journey trying to embed your own skills and mindsets, we're going to be covering some really, really key examples around that today. And lastly, essentially, it's about a lot of the panelists themselves have been working for many years, shaping the collective understanding across providers, funders, and government. So the intent of today is really to continue some of that conversation. Again, as I mentioned, it's a bit of a professional development piece, as well as some real examples how to embed it in your organisation. So let's unshare the slides and get into it. Luke, I might start with you, if that's all right. And as I mentioned, you've been a real pioneer in the outcome space, obviously social impact. And if it's fair, just to start, if we really look at it from a why perspective, can I get you kind of thinking and talking about why you see it's really important for leaders of different organisations to really have outcomes and impact really front and centre from a mindset point of view? And then secondly, can you paint a bit of a picture of where you think we are, the opportunities, some of the bright spots around impact that you see from your ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, thanks so much for having me here today, Andrew, and it's great to be talking alongside Suzanne and Myron. I think I'll talk about bright spots, but before I get there, it's sort of around outcomes. And White Box has been around for about 6 years now, and I'll never forget the wise advice that I had from one of our seed funders from government that said, you've got to get some runs on the board in the next 12 to 24 months if you want to really make this work. And that was advice that we sort of really took to heart and really tried to focus on as much as we could about getting outcomes. And if I think about the PBO, it was a pitch to a politician back in the day where we went, look, the employment system as it sits at the moment, and this, not much has really changed in the last 5 or 6 years, that, our country will spend about $3 billion a year helping people get back to work, especially for those with disability, for those that haven't worked for 9 out of the last 12 months. The success rate of people getting work and making it through to 12 months is less than 20%, right? And so with an average system of 30%, if that was a COVID jab, we wouldn't really be very happy. And I remember the pitch that we had to the politician at that time said, let us pitch something to you. And if we don't get paid, if we don't get the outcome, you don't pay us. And they were a bit like, well, how would that work? And I think that is really essentially what led to the PBO that we've been working with today. And it's interesting to note, if we look at bright spots, that when we started with the PBO and some of our work around the Self Fund, which is our $5 million patient capital loan fund that we've launched with the federal government and Macquarie and Westpac and a couple of others, it's about going, they want outcomes. And some of the funders and partners that we're looking and working with, outcomes has really become front and center of the conversation. And sometimes when we're talking with government, behind closed doors, the conversation that often comes up from different people is around, when we give grants, it's a bit like feeding the chooks. We know that some chooks will get the right feed. We know that some others, but we don't really know what we've done. We sort of write the check and it's there. And I think we have to really take those slight behind door comments and really listen to them and go, what are the outcomes that we're going to return? So when I get to bright spots, I think it's about talking about, at the moment, we've got a Labor government, and federally and in different states, we've got Liberal governments in place. And that's primarily in Queensland at the moment. And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see different changes. So it's important to know that a lot of the social enterprise stuff and a lot of the payment by outcomes conversation actually started with a Liberal government. And the current Labor government have done some really cool and interesting stuff, and they've really put forward the Outcomes Fund, but it's really quite small in comparison to the greater picture. And I think what's really interesting at the moment, if you're looking at different bright spots, if you look towards Queensland at the moment and you see a treasurer that's really focused on outcomes, and if you ever get to go and hear the new treasurer of Queensland talk, what you'll hear him talk about is the word grant, and doesn't want to use the word grant. And actually, there was a funding program that's been launched today that's called, that is actually, got to get the correct title, but it's
Yes.
Impact Revenue Investments. It was launched this morning, and there's webinars that you can join on. And yes, there'll be a 30%, I don't want to use the word grant component, but a pre-investment component up front. But when you sit and listen to the treasurer, they're trying to remove the word grant. And it's not that they're not going to give money to organizations anymore, but it's going to be, if you can give us outcomes, we'll give you funding. So I think things are changing, but when we talk to Labor governments as well, they go, well, we're comfortable with grants, and we don't mind paying up front a little bit. So I think we're coming all around. I know I've gone on a bit, but I think we're coming all around at the moment going, mindsets are moving towards outcomes, and a focus on outcomes. And I think now is the time to really take notice.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, look forward to hearing perhaps a bit more that the starting point, the payment by outcomes and the self-fund that you've driven as an organization, but then the political landscape, as you've painted that picture both federally and state, you've touched on some mindset, some language aspects. So I think that sets it up really nicely. Thank you. Myron, I might turn to you in terms of, running Bedford, second largest employer of disability, and some of the real leadership that you're taking as a in your own professional sense and as an organisation. Why do you think that outcomes mindset is really important at where we're at going forward?
Sure. I probably worthwhile explaining that I didn't come to the disability sector with a history in not-for-profit or disability at all. I came primarily from the commercial sector. And one of the things that struck me, I think there were probably two sort of situations. One, when I first came into Bedford, I inherited an office, and there were 2 whiteboards in my office, and every single possible problem that existed with employment within the NDIS was listed on those two whiteboards, but there were no solutions. There were just problems, and it sort of struck me. So the first thing I did was just clean those 2 whiteboards off and get rid of the problems and start to focus on solution. The second was I attended the Social Enterprise World Forum, which White Box Enterprise sponsored here in Brisbane, and I was hooked after about 2 days at the forum and in the potential of social impact investment and social enterprises. I guess what really came out of that in terms of outcomes, Andrew, was that the disability employment sector really was not outcome driven at all. It was a design that was essentially what I would call a subsidy that helped provide supports to participants who were employed within a provider of disability employment. The the community didn't offer a lot of opportunity for people with disability in terms of mainstream employment. So most people who have come with a disability wound up at a disability employment provider. But it struck me that there was no pathway for people to move beyond that. They entered into this sector. There was no outcome. In fact, there was no even outcome being applied or attempted. That was not part of the way that the funding existed. Probably goes back to Luke's payment by outcome that they ran. Why are we doing this? Why are we bringing people into this? We're putting them into a situation where they're essentially going to be here for the rest of their career. Then there's no opportunity being provided. There's a subsidy being paid, if you want to call it that, through the NDIS, but we're not actually making anything happen here that's to the benefit or the advantage of the person with disability. Whereas we could be doing that. We could actually create outcomes. So we decided that this was a pathway out of all of these two whiteboards full of problems, and that there was an actual solution here. And that solution could be that we could create businesses, commercially viable businesses, that actually addressed barriers to employment, including disability, and that we could actually do this in a number of different ways. But it was going to have to take an investment as opposed to a subsidy. So I actually probably align very well with the current treasurer in Queensland. I probably use the word subsidy instead of grant for this, the NDIS funding, but I actually see investment in outcomes as where we really need to be focused, in that if we really want to turn around the impact and create opportunity for people with disability to participate in the job sector, then it is all about investment and outcome. So our strategy, which I can explain a bit later, has really been to shift completely away from businesses that were really a legacy of historical funding, if you want to call it that. Providers like Bedford were paid to create jobs, and the more jobs we created, the more money we got in a subsidy. But at the end of the day, they weren't commercially viable businesses. They couldn't stand up on their own, and at some point we're going to not be able to exist going forward. And we certainly weren't creating the outcome for the individual with a disability that we had the potential to do so. So at Bedford, we've shifted our model completely to a social enterprise employment model. We still cater for people who have severe disability, which is probably, in my view, more of a foundational support than an outcome. And that's always going to be there. And I think everyone has the right to a job and the dignity of a job. So I don't want to see that disappear. But at the same time, a significant number of our employees, we can create a major impact in their lives, and also remove some of the funding criteria for government by creating these social enterprises.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. I think that frame of that, looking at it from that subsidy compared to investment, is really helpful. Because often even seeing it for what it is, this is what's happening, I think is the first part of understanding what's next. And I think, looking forward to certainly hearing about some of those investments you've made and are making in those newer business models. Really looking forward to hearing those. So thank you. And Suzanne, in the mental health space that you work in, I know you've recently opened up your strategy conversation. You've been talking to funders, partners, providers, government. You do a lot of work, state and federal. How do you look at impact and investment? We'll look to get into some of the more specific things next as well. But how do you look at that from a leader and an organisation perspective?
So Prevention United came to this conversation via a conversation that's happening, I think, across the not-for-profit sector, which is tightening of government funding opportunities and restricted funding markets, and really wanting to have impact. And in the mental health space, while we've had this, rapid rate of investment, still not sufficient, but increasing, we haven't seen those returns on investment in terms of greater experiences of mental health and wellbeing, particularly in children and young people, where their mental health and wellbeing is continuing to deteriorate over time. So that trend really led to the formation of Prevention United, and the look of really the systems that we have designed are not working for us. So when we talk about bright spots, there's growing recognition that the way in which we've set up systems to meet a range of needs are not working. And so the opportunity in time is really to think about what impact do we want to have and how do we get there. And so that's been the conversation that Prevention United has been having around what is needed in addition to a high functioning, treatment service system. But it also became really clear to us on that journey that the people doing the innovation in that space were in the impact investment sector and in the philanthropic sector. And so that started a journey of a whole range of conversations about how do you actually use that resource to achieve impact, because there's money and then there's money that has impact. And so what's the obligation on the part of the funder to really understand and have a diversified approach towards funding for impact? And in the mental health space, what we need is a diversified funding approach that covers, universal prevention through to selected and indicated prevention. Sorry to get technical this far into the conversation. Happy to
that's
expand on
fine.
what those are. But also from a Prevention United perspective, really seeing we're an advocacy organisation, as well as doing policy and thinking that government in and of itself can't do. Our federated system makes it hard. So how do we bring philanthropy? How do we bring kind of the policy expertise, the clinical expertise and the community expertise together to solve some of these problems, which, government is interested in doing, but doesn't necessarily have the bandwidth to be able to do. So from a strategy perspective for us, it was really about revisiting the idea of why we exist and getting really clear on where we add value, and then building capability in our partners to be able to have those conversations.
Brilliant. Thank you, Suzanne. I think, you see it right. Well, from a mental health perspective, I know you're working upstream as possible, and the government work you're doing in terms of getting them to understand these are the real problems, right through to the research and institutes, and look forward to hearing a bit more about the future generation piece shortly. Luke, if I could come back to you in terms of, you've seen over really a decade that the challenges in this overall space, we're talking about the mix of stakeholders, providers, government, funders, and perhaps philanthropy who are perhaps trying to move more into the impact space. Could you share maybe even talking to the payment by outcomes trial? I heard some of your colleagues speak on that at the Job Summit Forum you had in Melbourne. It was fascinating. You had the department there, you had some of your colleagues there. Can you share perhaps a bit of the lead up to that and even some of the learnings around that outcomes trial, even now and going forward? I think that could be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it started with what I mentioned before, which is this desire to go, the current employment system is just not working out. And it isn't a system that's designed for everyone to be able to flourish. And there's some really good solutions out there that just aren't seeing the light of day. And meanwhile, we've got social enterprises that have been primarily funded by philanthropy and a little bit by government over the last decade, but they're not able to really thrive in the way that they need to because their impact costs need to be funded in some way. And there was just this time when White Box was starting, and the story is quite funny because I found myself, Malcolm Turnbull somehow had opened Vanguard Laundry, and I found myself having the opportunity to get a follow-up meeting when he was out of government. And I just said, I need help with this. Have you got any ideas on how I could do it? And like Anne Ruston, and I said, well, is my internet okay, by the way?
It's a bit laggy. Well, yeah, well, if you keep going, it's a tiny bit laggy.
Tell me and I'll change rooms if I need to. And he said, how do you speak? He's spoken to Anne Ruston. I'm like, how does someone like me speak to Anne Ruston? And we got the conversation going. And it was this continual push to go, And at the time, it was very appropriate, but it wouldn't be appropriate now. And at the time, we were saying, we want to do something where we as a sector come to you in an aggregated approach. So there'll be white box representing initially 5, but ended up being 17 organizations, to be able to come to government and say, we're going to have outcomes for you, but if we don't get the outcome, you don't need to pay us. And at the time, with that government, that was very attractive. At the time, it was, there were different thoughts and feelings around the role of the nonprofit sector and how it looked. So that pitch at that particular time was very attractive. So we signed a 3-year agreement with the federal government where there was going to be, if we didn't get an outcome, we didn't get paid, we received no upfront money. It was for a very defined cohort and a very difficult cohort that a lot of social enterprises traditionally didn't work with. So it was for people that were 9 out of 12 months unemployed, and they had to be eligible for DES, so Disability Employment Services. And we would pay the social enterprises 50% of the first outcomes that they committed to in advance. And we used impact investors to be able to do that. And so we had Macquarie Bank, Triple, Hand Heart Pocket in Queensland that provided the capital that was incentive focused. So once again, no outcomes, no payment for them. So there was capital at risk, but it was government backed. And then we did a trial for 137 people where there would be outcome payments from the government at 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. And another payment that could be double dipped that went on if the organization supported the transition of that individual to a job outside the organization. And the success rates were profound. And I think it's important to note that those success rates were so profound that, we think that we could better them now because it was a startup organization essentially moving forward. And so it was a long journey. It was, the difficult things for us was that the majority of social enterprises that we were working with weren't used to working with that way. So we took it from 5 organizations to 17. And it took us 6 months longer to get people started than we had expected. But once we got that rolling, it worked really well. And government, they weren't used to working that way. There were 3 PBO trials initially. We'd join these phone calls where it'd be me and 2 members of our team and someone with seconded from Minter Ellison. And there would be, 11 to 14 people from government on the other end of the phone. It was through COVID when we were co-designing it. And it was a really tough thing to work out. But we got there, and I think it's, helped shape a whole lot of things that we see now with things like the Outcomes Fund and all that sort of stuff as well. But it was unique, different, difficult. But I think it's this idea where if there's no outcome, no payment. Now the current Labor government is saying to us things like, we don't mind paying a bit up front. We don't necessarily need you to take all the risk. And I think in the current environment, that's probably okay. But if there was a government change and we went back to those people that were in power before, they might like it more that way, where it's 100% risk and vice versa. So I think we showed a different model at the time. Our model will evolve and change, and we won't necessarily continue to do it in that way moving forward. But it was a great trial, and it continues to be a great trial. But we had to figure it out.
Brilliant. Yeah, those results are outstanding. I think it's very, very hard to ignore, even from a kind of some outsider perspectives. And I like how you talk there that, the thoughts of what we refer to the not-for-profit sector. I'm sensing there's a bit of a shift in thinking around where that's going. And that's a journey over time as well. So thank you for sharing that. I might just say, if you can move to somewhere which is a bit better, it's a bit laggy. If you can, if not, that's okay. Myron, in terms of just kind of a headline impact investment topic, I've heard if we go real kind of headline, I've heard you talk a bit about impact investment, and you were on the panel up in the Impact Summit in Sydney earlier this year. Even compared to the private equity mindset, I've heard you speak about that. We've heard you a bit now in terms of comparing it to the subsidy model. Can I get your thoughts in terms of where you see impact investment, either through some examples or just through learnings you've had in your own leadership, where it's heading?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about social impact, just for clarity from our perspective, we talk about we are the S in the ESG. Um, that's how we would approach impact investors. I think it's fair to say that the social impact investment in Australia is still early stage, and reasonably immature still. There's obviously a lot of opportunity for impact investment around environment, and most of the money could probably go there quite easily. The projects are of those sort of sizes. The social impact investment projects are probably not yet at that scale that would bring in the larger investors. So I might just answer your question by telling a little bit of a story. I mean, when we set out to create a business you referred to earlier called Cultivate, we actually made an acquisition of a commercial bakery. So a commercial bakery we're supplying Coles, Woolworths, Audi baked goods, and that acquisition was funded by Bedford. And we set that business up in a social enterprise, which was outside of our traditional structure. So it's not part of our NDIS business. And we did that in order to be able to actually bring in external capital. So after the acquisition, we went out to raise a small amount of capital. Our board asked us to walk before we run. So we raised $4 million to actually fund that acquisition. Even though we funded it initially, we raised that money. And so it was difficult. And in fact, it was just hard work to actually find our way to investors. There were lots of investors out there who would write larger size checks, but we weren't looking for that. So we wound up primarily probably in family offices, high net worth individuals, or foundations that were more or less aligned to what we were trying to do. So part of that was when we identified this acquisition, we were able to, through the due diligence, actually determine that about 30% of the jobs in that bakery could be filled by people with intellectual disability. And there was probably another 30 to 50% of those jobs that could be filled by people with other barriers to employment. So the whole thing was really based on a commercial acquisition, reverse engineer it into a social enterprise, and raise the funds in order to be able to scale that business from where it had been as a family business when we bought it. So I have to say there's some brilliant people out there, and we came across a number of organizations from an impact standpoint. Now, our investment had an 8% coupon attached to it, so it was a financial return as well. I suspect if it were purely impact investment, we would have really struggled to get it across the line at that level. So there's still a lot to happen in terms of impact investment in Australia. There are lots of models around the world that we can point to that are working and driving impact. I think there is a responsibility on the part of government to perhaps seed some of this and show the way, if I could sort of say it that way. And Queensland certainly starting to go that way with the fund that they created sort of 6-7 months back. And I think there's outcomes fund now in the federal government, but we need to see these funds starting to actually deploy those funds and start to invest in some of these opportunities to create that impact and show the way, really, in my view.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think it's a great observation.
Can I just add to that for a second, Andrew? Is that okay?
Yeah.
I did a raise recently for Beacon Laundry, and it was like $13 million. And we've done a number of these raises, and that for Beacon Laundry on its own, it was 37 different impact investors. And the the project almost didn't happen if I look at Beacon Laundry on its own. You know, we had some money from government, we had some money from different places, and there was a particular impact investor that I met that had already contributed about $500,000, and I went to visit them in their office, and I was about to send an email later that day to say, you know, we're out, we're not going to go ahead with this anymore. You know, I just wanted to let you know, and I was meeting with them about other work at the same time, and I was probably leaving that office with a bit of a tear in my eye, and I got a call about half an hour later from that high net worth individual that sort of saved the whole project, and they were and they put in the last $2 million to be able to make it possible. But you know, it's paying an 8% coupon. It was fairly reasonable. It was a startup, so it had risk attached. But the capital is simply not available in our country right now. And there's our chairman at Whitebox talks about it a bit like a Venn diagram that doesn't overlap. You've got, you know, when you go to the Impact Investment Summit at the moment, you've got a huge group of people over here that have a huge amount of deployable capital. But you've got a huge amount of people over here as well that are delivering this impact. And it's almost like these two groups of people, we can't find the way to get the deals done. And yes, Myron's right. We need government to help us facilitate that a little bit. We need organizations like yourselves to help facilitate that. But it's been about a decade now. And over this last decade, we haven't really been able to get it. We've got some great, you know, sugar bits of examples that we can sort of see, but the capital is rightly not available. And there are, like, if I look at Beacon, it's paying the coupons that can range between senior notes at 3% and sub notes at 12. It's structured in the right way. The deal almost fell over. And if I look at, there's a number of different deals that we've pulled together that pay market rates and some that don't. And that do all the things that I hear that we want at things like the Impact Investment Summit, but we're not pulling the capital together. They've got the right people behind them. They've got the right business plans. There's a mismatch and a missing middle at the moment. And together we can do more. And we need to, in our impact space at the moment, and impact providers that are on this call, we need to be building better examples, and we need to hustle the hell out of things. And we need to be showing the impact investors that we can deliver. And the impact investors, they need to come to our side a little bit and realize why we're not going to be 100% commercial on their side, but we'll get you your returns. And that's why we need to get that Venn diagram to overlap a bit. It's not as easy, but there's something that together we can solve.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in there? Oh, sorry. You go, Myron.
I was just going to add in there, Luke, I mean, our experience was that, you know, trying to raise 4 million, we were kind of in no man's land. We had a similar experience. We were just about to say we're not going to get there, and we invited one of the impact investors to come and spend 2 days with us, see what we were actually doing, spend some time with some of our employees, and at the end of the day, they wrote the last $1 million check to basically raise the 4 million. But if I look at the private equity market, it started very similar in Australia. It was a very small, immature market. There were a handful of players that were playing in it. But it really took off when international players came into that private equity market. Now there's some large private equity players now in Australia, you know, as a result of that, they've grown alongside of that. And I just feel like that we need to find a way that some of these known impact investors can actually put a toe in the water, for example, and actually help some of these smaller investments like a Beacon. $13 million is not a lot of money to raise when you're trying to build a laundry and do what you're doing. $4 million is not a lot of money to raise when we're trying to scale a bakery. We just don't have the access to people who could do that and sit alongside of us and actually work with us in how we create that impact. We can measure it. There's lots of different universities and centers for social impact that can assist us in all the measurement tools. But most people shy away because of the size of that investment. If you and I were going out there to raise $100 million, we'd be talking to people and we get the money before we get 4 or 13.
Brilliant. Thank you, Suzanne. Suzanne, can I?
Yeah, it's just if I come back to what Luke said, in terms of the 17 people going to government, it is about working in partnership, and it's all shifting a little bit. And that's certainly been our journey at Prevention United, because we're not speaking the same languages around what it is we are wanting money for, and, you know, working collaboratively. So we work to convene the Wellbeing and Prevention Coalition in Mental Health, which is a group of 20 leading mental health organisations to help understand where to target investment. So I see we've got a few GPs on the call, and you know, someone from Sexual Health Victoria. There's social determinants aspects to those problems that philanthropic and maybe impact investments. And Myron and I have been having a really interesting conversation about employment being a mental health promotion activity that promotes wellbeing, and we've had thriving talked about on the call. So we need to think about how do we work across systems, but how do we also start to talk the same language and in partnership. So if you think about what Future Generation Global have done, they've invested 87 million over their time in operation. They work with 14 impact organisations, one of which is us, but really thinking about what is the social problem they're trying to solve, and then mapping the funding against that through that diversified portfolio. And I think the same is true with impact investment around skilling up. You know, if we go with housing or disability as a problem, there's actually some underlying structural things we need to be thinking about as well that are part of that compelling narrative. And in partnership, we have no problem saying we need 100 million to fix that problem, and this is how you should divvy it up. And that's really what we're trying to do through the Wellbeing and Prevention Coalition. And there's models of that exist. So if you look at the Investment Dialogue for Australians' Children, that is a key funder of Thriving Kids Queensland. They recently just invested 23 million in sector coordination and upskilling. And that's an example of some of the leading philanthropic funds in Australia collaborating to achieve that social impact. And I think in the service delivery space and in the not-for-profit space, we've kind of been slow to catch up to that thinking. We're still thinking about grants. We're still thinking about direct funding from government, rather than thinking about partnership models of funding, what collective impact in partnership could look like. So that's a real shift I think we all need to be making to be able to come together to solve some of these big social problems which government in and of itself can't solve.
Yeah, thank you for providing that context, because there is a lot of people, as you mentioned, across that, you know, that healthcare space on the call. And I think just to clarify, you know, Brian, I saw your comment there, a fair comment. I think today we're bringing in what Luke has done, you know, really pioneering work in the payment by outcomes. We're not saying that there's no place for the other, perhaps more grant subsidy as a whole, but I think today's call is about really understanding that and pushing those boundaries. I'm going to open it up to questions, so feel free to put any questions in the comments or the Q&A. While we do that, Luke, in terms of kind of dipping the toe in the water, and I think it could be helpful for those people on the call who are pretty early stage to impact, is there anything that you could talk to, you know, any kind of wisdom or advice that's been helpful for you and your colleagues to kind of upskill knowledge in this area? Because it's a pretty broad area. Is there anything that so dipping the toe in the water from an education and a knowledge perspective, anything you could share?
Yeah, like I think for Whitebox, what we've been able to try to do is to have a menu of different options that meet people where they're at. And I think what we've learned is that when we're meeting impact investors, they're going to have a variety of different requirements. So I met a fund this morning in Korea, and it became pretty clear quite quickly that they only wanted to do equity. So, but that's okay, because even though we're non-profits, we've structured some deals that walk like equity and talk like equity, but really it's a debt note. And so we've been able to try and have those, you know, toe dipping exercises. We have a debt note that's really like giving a grant, but it's a returnable grant. So we've been trying to structure those ones. So for other people, we've been able to say, look, why don't you just come and sit on an advisory board or sit on an investment committee? And that can be your experience in there as well. So we're trying to change happens at the speed of trust, right? And so we're trying to give small opportunities in different ways where we say, look, this might be a 50K investment or a 100K investment, or if you're not ready for that yet, come and sit on our, because I think sometimes there's this mismatch that happens through trust that it's like, you just can't make a profitable business because you don't know how. If I bring my team in with you, we'll make you profitable. And it's like, cool, if you can do that with 100 people that have never really worked in the last 5 years, then I'd love that advice, right? So it's bringing people along on that journey because there's a mismatch in so many of these different areas. So yes, sometimes it might start with a small investment that dips your toe in the water, but sometimes it's a board seat. Sometimes we bring people along the journey where we say, just come and hang out on this project for a little bit. But it's just getting involved and observing, and I think confronting with good intent and seeking to understand. And yes, you might have a lot of answers in the space that you're in, but if you're trying to do something new and different, you got to go and, talk to 100 different people around that and really observe for a while and make yourself a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, I like it. Change happens at the speed of trust. I think it's a brilliant point in terms of the context of all those different stakeholders. And thank you for sharing just the breadth of, you met with the funding career. That's there's obviously broad conversations going on. So thank you for sharing that. Suzanne, I might turn to you in terms of, again, that starting point from leaders to advance their knowledge. Coming from perhaps someone coming from quite a traditional, a grant-based not-for-profit. Any thinking you'd have to share there?
Look, I think it's a real journey to go on as an exec group and with your board. At Prevention United, we're a relatively small organisation, so we're actually able to involve our whole team in that process. But we had to really focus on the impact we want to see rather than the organisational objectives, and then work with the people who are aligned with that impact outcome that we were seeking, and then thinking about how do we fund it. So again, I guess when you work in the health service system, there are funded models, national health agreements, those types of things that are not going anywhere anytime soon. And if you've been in the system long enough, you do see things that kind of come and go. And I do see this as a huge opportunity, but only if we leverage it and understand it and use it to look at system reform. That if it's just the shiny thing we chase after and we don't consolidate it with governance, with partnerships, with actually defining the outcomes and system reforms we're trying to achieve, then the danger is that we miss this opportunity and the problems that we are seeking to resolve. In our case, the declining rates of mental health in particularly children and young people, but across the board in the Australian community, then that is a missed opportunity. We just keep funding at an unsustainable rate of growth the mental health care system. And so absolutely those frank internal conversations and getting our own house in order in being able to think about this work and upskill in what that could look like, and thinking about what's the overall strategy for system reform rather than necessarily organisational sustainability. And that's been particularly appealing to funders, government and others that we are in conversation with.
Great. I think, getting clear on that, because the prevention space, you're in that real system reform space, aren't you? So getting clearer and clearer on that. And I'd welcome people to check out the work you're doing there. Getting your house in order, having those frank conversations at an executive and board conversation, as you say, it takes time, doesn't it? So to start those as early as possible, I think is really helpful.
And it's
Thank
a lot
you.
of pressure as a CEO. Like, I'm now responsible for KPIs that are not in my control. They're influencing, and that's a bold move. And it's because I have a supportive board that we can actually do that. They understand and have been quite strategic in how they've achieved that. But it's a different mindset.
For sure. Thank you. Kylie, thanks for your note there in terms of, there needs to be maturity in government speaking out about broader capacity, getting philanthropy, private investment, taking this more seriously in Australia. So thank you for your comments there.
And Myron, Andrew, I think the role of philanthropy is really key. And there's also a mismatch there at the moment. I think you've got in Queensland, one of the things that we've been trying to focus on with government is that only Queensland has a share of the philanthropy pool that's about 6%. And so if you work that out per population, you say Queensland's roughly 20%, how do you get it to even? There's a whole bunch of complicated reasons as to why we don't get the share of philanthropy and why should we and all that sort of stuff. But something that the Queensland Treasurer did to address that was to form a philanthropy roundtable to be able to say, cool, so we're going to kick in money to stimulate this space that you guys, philanthropy, have seeded. And so how are you going to come to the table? And you don't have to match us per se directly, but there's now a roundtable chaired by the Treasurer in Queensland that brings 15 philanthropists together, chaired by Alan English as a philanthropist to help lead that work. And I think it's that sort of partnership that's looking a bit different. But on the federal side, what's interesting is sometimes you've got you'll go and have meetings with people, and I think many of us have had this experience where they say to you, why don't you go talk to philanthropy? Because I hear they have lots of money available. And it's this weird thing where government are expecting philanthropy to sort of pick up where they can't. But really the role of philanthropy is to help with those market failures that government can't, to help them get started. And so I think the best way is, let's not pick sides. Let's not say this is better and that's crap and that sort of stuff. We need everyone, a bit like what Suzanne's saying, to collaborate and be working together. And that's easier said than done. But I think, we've really got to wake up, confront with good intent, see the good in everything and bring it together. And yeah. That's
the conversation we have in those meetings is, what's the alternative? Keep doing what we're doing. Yes, it's hard, but there's such important conversations that there isn't an alternative.
Yeah,
so true. And Myron,
I
I'll
think
give the last word to you in essence of time. So yeah, what's your thoughts?
No, I was just going to reflect back on when Amanda Rishworth was the Minister for the Department of Social Services. She spoke at the Philanthropy Australia conference, the last conference here in Adelaide. And one of the things she talked about was the collaboration between philanthropy, government, and impact investment, and how those three needed to come together, a little bit around what Suzanne and Luke have both just been talking about. And I think one of the things we see, and one of the things we're trying to talk to philanthropy about, is them becoming the sort of catalytic capital, if you want to call it that, to actually get these things rolling and get others involved and bring other people involved. And maybe that is a way to get the larger impact investors to maybe put a toe in the water by having a collaboration between philanthropy, government, and impact investment. So I think there's a role here for all of us to try to keep having these conversations, bring these together, and make this happen in Australia, just like we see around the world.
Brilliant. Well said. In essence of time, we've got to wrap it up. Just briefly, in terms of, we'll be sharing a heap of useful and hopefully valuable links from some of the things that the panelists have talked to today. And just to urge you to really look at that, upskilling both yourself from a leadership and from a strategy perspective. What we see is really embedding that early stage conversation when you're looking at that 3-5 year strategy, having those really frank, honest conversations. Are we really where we need to be from an impact and understanding that? We see that opening up the strategy conversation is actually really helpful. And it might seem strange, but early conversations, bringing in philanthropy, impact investment, and even government into those conversations. As Luke said, let's not pick sides. We've got a lot of challenges to work through. And again, shifting from that activity-based subsidy mindset, as you mentioned, Myron, I don't think today we're saying that that's no longer existing, of course, but the panel today are really cutting edge and pioneering this outcome space. Check out some of the links, including the payment by outcomes trial, and some others we'll be putting out there. And lastly, feel free to get in touch with any of the panelists, of course, accessible on LinkedIn. I know they're all open to a conversation and sharing insights. And myself, feel free to get in contact directly to the website, LinkedIn. We're looking to build a series of ongoing panel conversations in sharing more detail on the topic. So we thank you for your attendance. Thank you all again, panelists, for sharing your experience and insights, and look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.